In today's video, we'll be talking about the realism coming to Grand Theft Auto 6. How realistic is this next title going to be? Will it be too realistic, or will it be just enough? And of course, as with anything, we have people on both sides. We have the people that are pushing for realism, and then we have the people that still want GTA to be arcadey. We'll be looking at some changes from the leaks and the trailer we know Rockstar Games is bringing to the physics, gameplay, and graphics so we can have a better idea of how realistic this next GTA will be. But before we do that, we must acquaint ourselves with what realism in video games is and how it is determined. It's important to point out that realism in games is not a single unified idea. Instead, the concept of realism can be applied to numerous different aspects of a single game, and the amount of realism can vary in each. You can have realism in artwork, realism in mechanics, realism in character, and emotional realism. Each of these areas has places where realism is beneficial and places where they can detract from your game. Realism is not a black and white choice. Do I want to be realistic or not? Instead, it is a spectrum with infinite shades of variation between completely abstract and completely realistic. So really the question is not when should realism be used, but how do you determine the right level of realism for your game? We can have visual realism, mechanical realism, character and story realism, and historical and cultural realism. Visual realism is also known as graphical realism. That includes the graphics of the game itself, the way they're developed and created by the developers, and not the graphical settings or those that depend on your system, those that can be tweaked inside the game. So this comes down to the artistic direction and art style that the developers are going for. So we're not talking about the improvements such as ray trace, global illumination and reflections, and subsurface scattering that will be coming to GTA 6. That's all good, even though this may correlate with the realism. We're talking about the realism from a stylistic perspective. Let's read this piece of this article by game developer that I'll leave a link to in the description so it gives us a better idea. One major thing to keep in mind when deciding on a visual style for your game is what do these visuals convey about my game. The level of visual detail and accuracy can affect the player's expectations for your game. In other areas such as character, story, and mechanics, for example, if your game has a highly realistic visual style, players will likely expect the mechanics to match. Players will expect a realistic looking shooter to have more authentic, ballistic, and authentic levels of accuracy and kickback. On the other hand, if your shooter game has a more stylized visual aesthetic, players might expect a more unique take on the shooting mechanics. They will be more lenient about the authenticity of the shooting mechanics and will have a higher tolerance for unrealistic or even goofy weapons and attacks. Similarly, players will expect worlds and characters that appear more realistic to behave in a more realistic way. Silly antics that fit perfectly well into a game like Katamari would feel very out of place in a game like Dark Souls. Realism is not only the aspect of a game visual style that can set these expectations. Features like color, cultural influences, and lighting can all have an impact as well, but the level of realism certainly plays a major part. So what this basically tells us is that if a game looks cartoony, you would expect all other aspects of the game to also have a certain level of silliness or goofiness in them. Whereas if a game's visuals are realistic, you would expect all other aspects of the game to also be realistic. There are also exceptions, but we won't go into those. Generally, that's what we assume. So when we watch the trailer for GTA 6, there's one thing that becomes clear. The game isn't going for photorealism. It has a very specific art style that is very clear to notice. Everything from the character models to the lighting, the vibrant colors. Even though there's a certain level of realism and the game does look pretty close to real life, the art style that the developers are aiming for becomes apparent. There's a certain level of cartooniness to the characters, which I presume has been influenced by the older Grand Theft Auto games as well. Grand Theft Auto has always had that cartoony element. The vibrant color palette in combination with the bright sunsets plus the lens flares create a unique feel for the game. Even Digital Foundry said it in their breakdown, character rendering seems to take a more stylistic realism approach instead of photorealism. So when looking at this art style, what can we extrapolate? What does this make us expect from the rest of the elements of the game? You would also expect the physics of the game to not be a complete one-to-one recreation to real life. This leads us to the next point, mechanical realism. Mechanics are one area where I believe realism should almost always take a backseat to gameplay. On the one hand, it is practically impossible to make a video game world that corresponds 100% with the real world. The real world is simply full of so much detail, randomness, and possibility that trying to mimic that in a virtual world is a fool's errand. To illustrate this point, let's just take the potential actions I could take at this very moment. Right now, I'm sitting on a couch typing on a laptop. However, even in this simple situation, I have a million possibilities for actions. Sure, I have choices about what to type, but I also have the ability to scratch my nose, wiggle my toes, or stand up and throw my laptop out a window. Odds are if I was playing a video game, some of these possibilities will be programmed into the game, but most of them will not be. The key is not to try and give your players every possibility, but to make sure that the possibilities you do give them are as interesting and fun as possible. So in the particular case of Grand Theft Auto, where the game is a recreation of real life, even though exaggerated and parodic, the physics still needs an element of realism. And with the fact that Rockstar said that this entry was going to be the biggest and most immersive entry in the Grand Theft Auto series, in addition to what we saw from the leaks, it is safe to say that the game will be closer to realism than to the opposite. opposite. In fact, this will be the most realistic GTA we've seen so far, and most likely the most realistic Rockstar title, with tweaks to the Euphoria physics and a load of added mechanics that will now make most processes in the game take longer. This title will tighten the gap between games and realism. However, as we just said, a game cannot be 100% realistic due to the unlimited possibilities of real life, and also because the game still needs to be fun. And I want to discuss what originally made me want to make this video, and it is the gas stations in GTA 6. This is one subject that's been widely discussed across the GTA fanbase, and it is one of the biggest memes in the GTA 6 community. Should cars in GTA run out of gas? But GTA 6 almost on the horizon fans want to see several features in the upcoming title. While some of them are genuinely intriguing, others have divided the community. One of the biggest things several fans wish to see is a car refueling system. The prime example is the Mafia series, where the car often runs out of gas and the players must find a fueling station to get it back running. While this idea sounds interesting, it has divided the community. While some want to see a realistic feature like this, others argue that it will be troublesome and unnecessary for a Grand Theft Auto game. One side argues that adding a car fuel system will make GTA 6 a much more realistic game. Several video games have successfully implemented this feature, but none of the Grand Theft Auto titles have seen something like this before. On the other hand, other fans don't want Rockstar Games to add such a feature to the upcoming title. They argue that it is completely unnecessary and will only cause discomfort to players, especially during intense police chases or free roam. Fans expect to see several other changes in GTA 6, but this is not one of them. Evidently, most players are against this idea, as it will be annoying to keep refueling the vehicle in GTA 6. This will hamper the free roam exploration, as fans would hesitate to travel long distances. However, as one of them suggested, if Rockstar decides to implement it, there should be an option to enable/disable it. Let me know in the comments if you guys would like to see a refueling system in GTA 6. Should it be an option, or should it be completely left out of the game? Leave a comment. Moving on to something a little bit different, character and story realism. In contrast to the previous section, this is one area where I believe striving for realism can have some of the biggest benefits for your game. Humans are social animals, and we're designed to interact with and recognize other humans. We instinctively know when a character is behaving unrealistically, and it can break our suspension of disbelief and ruin our immersion in the game. The reason I'm grouping character and story realism together is because I believe that every good story is driven by its characters. The characters have motivations and goals that cause them to take actions, and these actions drive the plot forward. Therefore, in order to create a satisfying story, it is necessary to have characters with realistic personalities and motivations. As with all things, this rule has some caveats and exceptions. Depending on the type of game, your character might be extremely simple with very little personality. They might also have extremely loud, outlandish personalities that would not seem to fit the traditional definition of realistic. That is okay as long as it fits the tone of the game and players understand why they're doing what they do. Take Mario for example. In the early Mario games, and to some extent even the more recent ones, Mario has basically no personality. However, he does have a motivation to rescue Princess Peach, and it is this motivation that drives the action of the game forward. Rockstar Games are masters at storytelling. This is where realism is most necessary. Rockstar has always succeeded in bringing the stories as close to reality as possible. Take RDR 2 for example. This is where the acting and the writing, everything comes together to create one cohesive and believable story. We don't know much about the story of Grand Theft Auto 6. That's perhaps one of the most controversial topics around GTA 6. I do believe that this will be one of the best Rockstar Games stories, up there with Red Dead Redemption 2, but that's just how I see it based on the material we've seen so far. Again, we don't know enough and we can only hope for the best. But moving on to historical and cultural realism. For this category, I think the amount of realism you choose to include in your game is very dependent on the type of game you're making. Some games such as the Assassin's Creed series pride themselves on having a high level of historical and cultural accuracy. However, I do not believe that this level of accuracy is necessary for all or even most games. That being said, if you're including elements of a culture that are not your own, I would caution you to do enough research to make sure that you're using those cultural elements in a way that is not disrespectful to the original culture. Even if it is entirely unintentional, taking parts of another culture can be a minefield and can result in negative press for your game. And with this aspect specifically, mistakes happen. A recent example I can recall is Insomniac mistaking the flag in the Spider-Man game. Rockstar always does research of their areas, but we'll see. That's pretty much all regarding the realism I wanted to discuss in today's video. You can find links to the articles discussed in this video in the description. If you enjoyed the video, a thumbs up would be appreciated. Subscribe to the channel for more GTA 6 videos just like this one. If you want to participate in the giveaway of an Xbox Game Pass, 3 months for PC, make sure to join my Discord server from the link in the description. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.